You ever think about like all the medical breakthroughs we have now? Like the vaccines and treatments and the research? It's just amazing, right? And today we're going to deep dive into a story about one of those breakthroughs. A story about science and race and ethics, and it all starts with a woman named Henrietta Lacks.
Well, her story is so interesting because it makes you look beyond just the scientific discovery part of it. There's a human side to it, too, that we don't always think about?
Hmm.
Like every medical discovery comes from somewhere. There's a story there in a family, and we should acknowledge that and try to understand it.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a human story. And we're going to use a couple sources for this deep dive. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. That's a book by Rebecca Skloot. She does a great job telling the story of Henrietta's life and what happened with her cells. And we'll also look at an episode of the My Favorite Murder podcast. They did a great job with the story, too. Really captivating. So let's go back in time to the 1950s. Segregation was still a huge problem, and there was a lot of distrust of the medical system, especially in the black community. I mean, you had stuff like the Tuskegee syphilis study happening, so there were reasons for people to be suspicious.
Yeah, that's super important to understand. Like, try to imagine what it was like back then. Segregation everywhere, even in hospitals and healthcare. And black patients had to deal with discrimination, bad treatment sometimes, and they had a lot of reasons to not trust doctors and hospitals.
Yeah, for sure. It was in this environment that Henrietta Lacks, a young black mother of five, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for treatment for cervical cancer. And during her treatment, they did a biopsy. Seemed routine at the time, but it ended up changing medical history.
This is where it gets really interesting. So they took a sample of her tumor and sent it to the lab, which was normal back then. But then they saw something really weird. Her cells, they didn't die. They just kept replicating outside her body, like forever.
Wow, they were basically immortal. Can you imagine the shock? Had they ever seen anything like it before?
Nope, it was completely unprecedented. And her cells, they became known as HeLa cells. And let me tell you, they totally changed medical research. Scientists could study diseases, test drugs, develop treatments, all thanks to these cells.
So like the polio vaccine, treatments for AIDS, cancer research, gene mapping, all that stuff. Millions of lives were saved thanks to Henrietta's cells.
It's mind-blowing when you think about the sheer scope of it. Like leukemia, Parkinson's, even influenza. They used them to figure out how radiation and toxins affected cells, which made treatments and stuff way safer.
And the crazy part is, this was all happening without Henrietta or her family even knowing. I mean, they had no clue that a part of her was alive in labs all over the world.
Yeah, my favorite murder brought that up. I mean, it's just tragic, right? All these scientists were celebrating this amazing discovery, but her family was at home grieving and dealing with the loss. They had no idea a part of her was still out there helping make these huge advancements.
So how did they even find out?
It wasn't until the 70s, and it wasn't even from a doctor or anything. It was just by chance. They ran into a researcher who recognized their last name.
Oh, wow. What a way to find out.
Imagine the shock. They were suddenly faced with this crazy idea that a part of their mother was alive and thriving in labs all over the world, and it was taken without them even knowing.
I bet that was tough. And then having to try and understand it all. And then they probably had to fight for recognition and justice and everything.
Yeah, it was definitely a long and difficult journey for them. It wasn't easy for them at first. Like you said, they were confused and scared. And the scientists, well, they seemed more interested in the cells themselves than in Henrietta as a person. It's kind of like how sometimes science gets so focused on the discovery part that it forgets about the human side of things?
Yeah, totally. I mean, try putting yourself in their shoes. You find out your mother's cells were taken without anyone telling you, and now they're like this big scientific thing. It's a lot to take in.
It really makes you think about like ownership and consent. Who actually owns human tissue? Do you still have control over your cells once they're not in your body anymore? These questions sound simple, but there's a lot of ethical and legal stuff tied up in them.
Well, back then, when they took Henrietta's cells, informed consent wasn't really a thing. I mean, it was a different time. Patients trusted their doctors a lot more, especially in a system that didn't always treat them fairly.
Yeah, and that lack of transparency made things even worse for the family. They felt betrayed, like so someone violated their privacy. And it felt like their mother was just reduced to a science experiment.
My favorite murder talked about this part from the book that really got to me. Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, she was so desperate to learn more about her mother. She barely remembered her. She just wanted to know like the little things.
Yeah.
What did her mother's perfume smell like? What was her favorite color? What did her laugh sound like? It's heartbreaking because it shows that behind all this science stuff, there's a real human story of loss and grief and just wanting to connect with someone they loved.
Yeah. And you see Deborah trying to understand her mother's legacy while these scientists are busy mapping chromosomes and studying cells. She's trying to find the essence of her mother, the things that made her who she was.
The podcast also talked about how hard it was for the family to get recognition for Henrietta's contribution. Some researchers didn't take them seriously. Institutions didn't want to admit what happened. It seemed like everyone cared more about protecting science than about doing the right thing.
It shows you how imbalanced things can be, especially between marginalized communities and institutions like in medicine and research. The Lax family's concerns and their right to be a part of Henrietta's story, they were pushed aside.
It's a good thing Rebecca Skloot came along. She actually treated the Lax family with respect and empathy, something they hadn't really experienced before. She saw that this wasn't just about science, it was about real people. And she wanted to tell the story the right way.
Yeah, she really took the time to build a relationship with them, especially with Deborah. And she made sure they were a part of telling the story.
Deborah's involvement was so important. She got to tell her family's story from their perspective. Her mother wasn't just some cells in a lab. She was a mother, a wife, a person with a life outside of all that.
And Deborah learned so much about her mother through this process. She saw how strong and resilient her mother was, how much she loved her family, how much she laughed. It's like she got to know her mother in a whole new way.
Skloot's book, and then the movie with Oprah playing Deborah, it brought Henrietta's story to the world. And it started a conversation about informed consent, patient rights, and the ethics of using human tissue. And that conversation's still going on today.
Yeah, it really is. What happened to the Lax family shows that we have to be ethical in how we do science. We have to respect people's autonomy and be transparent.
The Lax family's story is inspiring, though. They never gave up. Even with all the adversity they faced, they fought to honor Henrietta's legacy and to make sure she got the recognition she deserved. And their story helped bring about some positive changes in the medical community.
Right. Their fight wasn't just about Henrietta, though. It was about all the injustices that have happened to communities of color in healthcare and research.
What they went through showed how the system failed to protect their rights, their privacy, and their mother's legacy. But they didn't just sit back and complain. They became advocates for change. They fought for transparency, better informed consent practices, and fairness in who benefits from scientific advancements.
They're a great example of why it's important to listen to marginalized communities, challenge the way things have always been done, and fight for a better system for everyone.
And even while they were doing all that, they were still dealing with their own personal grief and loss. I remember in the book, there's a part where Deborah talks about wanting to know what her mother's perfume smelled like or what her favorite color was, like these basic things that science can't answer. It's really sad because it shows how much they lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really puts things in perspective. Science is amazing and can do so much, but it can't replace the personal connection you have with someone you love. Deborah's search for those little details about her mother, it really highlights the loss that the Lax family experienced.
Yeah. And on top of that personal loss, Deborah also became very aware of the ethical questions surrounding her mother's cells. The podcast host, they mentioned a quote from Deborah where she says, "I would like some health insurance so I don't got to pay all that money every month for drugs my mother's cells probably helped make."
It's like, wow. Her mother's cells helped revolutionize medicine. And yet here she is, her own daughter struggling to afford the very treatments that her mother's cells may have helped create. It's a pretty stark reminder that scientific progress doesn't always mean everyone gets to benefit equally.
Exactly. Her statement really highlights this intersection between scientific advancement, ethical concerns, and social justice. It makes us think about who really benefits from these discoveries and who gets left behind. It makes us think about how we can create a healthcare system that's fair for everyone.
My favorite, Murder, also talked about how companies made a lot of money from HeLa cells, right? But the Lax family, they didn't see any of that money. It makes you wonder, should people or their families be able to profit from their cells, especially if companies are making money from them?
It's a tough question, this whole thing about tissue ownership and whether it's okay to profit from human biological material. Some people say you have a right to your own cells. Other people say science should come first, and that once cells are taken out of the body, they belong to science, not the person.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's clear that the Lax family's story has made people more aware of these ethical issues. It sparked conversations about informed consent, transparency in research, and making sure that the benefits of science are shared fairly.
Definitely. And in the middle of all this, we can't forget that there's a human story here. The podcast mentioned a part in the book where Deborah is visiting a lab and they hand her a vial with her mother's cells in it. She starts crying and whispers, "You're famous. Just nobody knows it."
That's such a powerful image. It's kind of bittersweet. It speaks to the fact that Henrietta's contribution was huge but unrecognized for a long time. And it shows how hard her family fought for recognition and understanding.
In recent years, there's been a lot more effort to honor Henrietta Lacks and what she did for science. There have been conferences and scholarships, and now her story is taught in schools.
That's good to hear. But it sounds like the Lax family is still fighting to make sure Henrietta gets the recognition she deserves. And they want to make sure her story leads to positive changes in the scientific and medical communities.
Yeah, they're incredible for continuing to advocate for that. Henrietta Lack's story is a powerful reminder that science isn't just about data and experiments. It's about people. It's about the impact they have on the world and the stories they leave behind.
It's been really eye-opening to deep dive into Henrietta Lack's life and learn about her immortal cells. Her story shows how science, ethics, and social justice are all connected. It makes us think about how we can make sure that medical advancements are ethical and that everyone benefits from them.
The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is a great book. It's not just about science. It's about family, race, poverty, and it's a story about hope and resilience. It makes us think about the ethical side of scientific progress.
This deep dive has been amazing, really thought-provoking. It's reminded us that behind every scientific discovery, there's a human story. Henrietta Lack's story encourages us to think about how we can create a more just and equitable world.
We really hope you'll check out the book and listen to the My Favorite Murder episode. It's important to keep learning about Henrietta Lacks and her story.
Henrietta Lack's cells may be immortal, but it's her story, her spirit, and her family's strength that will continue to inspire us all.
And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of Henrietta Lacks and her immortal cells. We want to thank you for joining us.